Apooyak'ii, and welcome to the University of Lethbridge's Public Professor Series. Our university's Blackfoot name is Iniskim, meaning Sacred Buffalo Stone. The University of Lethbridge acknowledges and deeply appreciates the Siksikaisatapis people's connection to their territory. We, as people living and benefiting from Blackfoot Confederacy territory, honor the traditions of people who have cared for this land since time immemorial. We recognize the diverse population of Indigenous peoples who attend the University of Lethbridge and the contributions that these Indigenous peoples have made in shaping and strengthening the university community in the past, in the present, and in the future. My name is Matt Letts, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science at the University of Lethbridge. On behalf of the University of Lethbridge, it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's talk with University of Lethbridge Sociology Professor Apooyak'ii, Dr. Tiffany Prete, as she presents the Kainai Stolen Children Era. Tiffany is a member of the Kainai blood tribe of the Siksikaisatapi or Blackfoot Confederacy, located within Treaty 7 territory, right here. Dr. Prete is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology, and her program of work is comprised of implementing the Truth and Reconciliation Committee calls to action on the Blood Reserve. Tiffany earned her Bachelor's of Elementary Education, specializing in math and science, completed her Master of Education and her Doctor of Philosophy, PhD, in Education at the University of Alberta. The University of Alberta recently recognized Tiffany with an award, the Horizon Award, stating, when they gave her the degree, or the award, that those who hear her speak never forget it. And so that's important for us tonight. She tackles difficult subjects with eloquence and humanity. We couldn't agree more, and congratulate Tiffany on being celebrated in this way by the University of Alberta. Before coming here to Iniskim, the University of Lethbridge, Tiffany received a Social Science and Humanities Research Council, or SSHRC, postdoctoral fellowship. She was also an inaugural recipient of the University of Calgary's Provost's Postdoctoral Award for Indigenous and Black Scholars. Dr. Prete has an extensive background in educational policy studies, specializing in Indigenous peoples' education. Her expertise includes Indigenous secondary retention rates within the public school system, Blackfoot historical research, impacts of colonization, intergenerational trauma, and Indigenous research methodologies. In her spare time, and it's related to research, as you'll see, Tiffany is a Native American beadworks enthusiast and published a research paradigm that was grounded in an Indigenous worldview guided by Native American beadwork. Please join me in welcoming Apooyak'ii, Dr. Tiffany Prete, to the podium to present the Kainai Stolen Children Era.
Oki, Nistu, Nidanagu, Apooyak'ii. My name is Dr. Tiffany Prete, and thank you all for coming and joining me tonight for my presentation. I am absolutely thrilled to be here today to share with you my research, and I want to thank Catherine Reeder for inviting me here tonight to give a talk for the Public Professor Series. So thank you, Catherine. My program of work, as Dean Letts has already shared with you, revolves around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action. And I'm going to be talking about that more later. But I do want to thank some individuals who initially helped me as I started into this program of work. So I want to thank Dr. Tupper, who's the Dean of Education at the University of Alberta, as well as Dr. Prochner, who is the Departmental Chair of Educational Policy Studies at the University of Alberta. I also want to acknowledge my Chief and Counsel for approving this research project, as well as the participating elders who took part in this research study. I also want to thank the participating museums and archives, as well as to Jeremy Scott from Uppercase Creatives, who worked as the videographer on this research project, to the National Indian Brotherhood, who generously funded my first project within my program of work, and to Matthew Prete, who acted as translator on my project. So I always like to start off my presentations by first locating myself and my work, which also includes my own take on a land acknowledgement. And so I will be focusing specifically on my Blackfoot people today, and I'm going to take some time to introduce Blackfoot traditional territory to you. So I have a map up of Blackfoot traditional territory, and we originally occupied the land from the North Saskatchewan River, east to the Sandhills in Saskatchewan, south to the Yellowstone River, and west to the Rocky Mountains. Blackfoot Confederacy is comprised of 4 tribes. We have 3 here in Canada, which is Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai. And then in the United States, we have Apooyak'ii, Piikani. And so I put a little dot just underneath Lethbridge to illustrate where the Blood tribe is, which I think many of us here are already aware of where the Blood tribe is. And this is a picture of where I grew up and is a part of my people's traditional territory. I actually took this in my parents' backyard, and it is the most beautiful place on the earth to me. So my people are the Blackfoot tribe that is located next to the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains in Canada. My reserve is located in southwestern Alberta. We're about 20 minutes north of the Canada-US border. And my reserve is the largest land-based reserve in Canada. We're just short of being 1,500 square kilometers, and we have a band membership of over 13,000 members. So here is an overview of the topics that I'm going to speak about today. I'm going to give a brief background to this research study. I'll review the colonial school models and speak to the school model origins, including some of the policies that surrounded the colonial school system. And then I will talk about why everyone should care about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action. And then we will end with a Q&A. So as a child, I recognized that there was something going on around me that was so profound, it was almost tangible. But I didn't have the words to articulate what I was experiencing. I was constantly being bombarded with the question of, why can't you just get over it? And how does one move on from something that has lasted over a century and was so significant that the impacts are still being felt today? Particularly as an intergenerational survivor, when I did not experience these schools firsthand. And to remedy my lack of knowledge, I turned to research, where I've been responding to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action, and specifically working with number 78, which is to assist communities to research and produce histories of their own residential school experience and their involvement in truth, healing, and reconciliation. So the first half of my research study consisted of traveling to numerous archives and museums across Canada to collect primary and secondary documents that were written by the Canadian government, their officials, and the different religions that ran church-sanctioned schools on reserves. And the second half of the research project was bringing these documents back to my home reserve and working with a group of elders to go through the documents and analyze the policies that are behind the Stolen Children Era. And since the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action in 2015, there has been more awareness in Canada about the Stolen Children Era. However, as a Canadian society, we have a tendency to narrow our focus on this era, which is residential schools exclusively, when in fact, there is so much more that happened in addition to residential schools that we need to know, understand, and remember. And normally when I focus on this topic, I would go through the different school models in detail with you, including how each school models differ from one another, some of the policies behind the school models, and share stories that I've learned about each school model in their respective eras. And to do this topic justice, I need more than an hour to be able to go through all this information with you. And unfortunately, I don't have enough time to go through all of that tonight. But if you are interested in learning more about this topic, I will be giving an abridged virtual presentation on January 20th of next year. as part of the University of Lethbridge Department of Sociology Speaker Series. And so at the end of this presentation, I'll put the invitation up. There's a QR code on it if you're interested in joining me and learning more about the Stolen Children Era. So I'm going to attempt to do an activity with you, and normally I would have access to the internet to do this activity, which unfortunately I don't presently. I was going to send you to menti.com and have you answer a particular question. So instead of doing that tonight, I will still ask the question, and you can just think about what your answer would be, and then I will tell you the answer. So on the board, I have a list of different numbers that represents how many different school models you think the government used to try and assimilate Indigenous children with. Do you think it was 2 school models, 4 school models, 8 school models, 6 school models, I think I skipped that, and 10 school models? So I'm just going to give you a few moments to think about that before I move on. So I hope that was enough time to think about what your answer is. And to reiterate, there is so much more that happened in addition to residential schools that we need to be aware of. There is actually 8 different school models that the Canadian government has had in place for over a century and a half to try and assimilate Indigenous children into Canadian society. And each of these school models falls into one of the 2 assimilation policies that the Canadian government used to try and assimilate Indigenous children. The Canadian government first tried assimilating Indigenous children by segregating them from society and trying to teach them to be like the rest of Canada. The second assimilation policy is where the Canadian government decided to immerse Indigenous children into Canadian society, hoping that being around non-Indigenous peoples would rub off on both the student as well as the parent. And I'm going to share with you what each of those school models are under their respective assimilation policy. So we first start off with segregation, and we have mission schools, day schools, industrial schools, boarding schools, residential schools, and then under the assimilation through integration policy, we have public schools, residency schools, and day schools at the same time, as well as federal schools. So again, unfortunately, I don't have time to go through each of the school models to tell you what the difference is between each of them, but if you would like to learn more, I hope that you'll join me next January. I also do want to note that I'll be using the terms Indigenous, Aboriginal, Native American, and Indian interchangeably throughout the presentation, depending on the context. And the historical documents that I studied would generally use the term Indian, which is no longer politically correct. And so I would highly encourage everyone to use the term Indigenous peoples today. And the language that I like to use when talking about this topic is the Stolen Children Era. And today, as I've already mentioned, there is this emphasis on residential schools, which is important to remember and to talk about, as many survivors today attended residential schools. But I think we also need to remember that a lot of children were also taken from their home and their families and forced to attend these colonial schools beyond the residential school system. And so I choose to use the term Stolen Children Era to represent all of the children under Indian policy who were unwillingly taken from their families and forced to attend these colonial schools. And so you might be wondering, how exactly did these school models come into existence? And again, we unfortunately don't have time to go through all of the history. But suffice it to say, after the initial point of contact and colonization began to occur, the traditional lands of the Indigenous peoples here in Canada began to be settled by colonizers. And those who were in power started to write series of laws and legislation that was meant to control and dictate the lives of Indigenous peoples, which was referred to as Indian policy. And eventually, the following policy would be mandated from the Gradual Civilization Act, which came out in 1857. Open quote, able to speak, read, and write either the English or French language readily and well, and is sufficiently advanced in the elementary branches of education, and is of good moral character and free from debt, close quote. And so it was the goal of to have every Indigenous person in Canada to obtain these attributes. But how would the Canadian government make this a reality? And so this act came out in 1857, and it would be a number of years before the policy would be actualized by the large majority of Indigenous peoples here in Canada. And it would take a number of more laws and legislations being created before Indigenous peoples would be forced to embody such attributes. And one of the laws and legislations that made these attributes possible were the numbered treaties. And there are 11 numbered treaties, all negotiated between 1871 and 1921. And it should be noted that not all of Canada is under one of the numbered treaties. It was an agreement between sovereign nation to sovereign nation where certain rules, regulations, and obligations were agreed upon to share Indigenous lands. And the numbered treaties were needed in order for the traditional lands of the Indigenous peoples to be legally settled by colonizers. And it also provided a framework for the coexistence together. So every treaty is different depending on the negotiation talks. And the numbered treaties largely grew from the desire of the Canadian government for economic expansion across Canada. And the numbered treaties are just as relevant today as they were when they were first negotiated. The rules and regulations outlined in the treaties is what makes it possible that we can come together today to learn, to work, to live, and to enjoy life on the traditional lands of the Blackfoot people. And within the treaties outline certain promises and obligations that the government and settlers of these lands have agreed to uphold. And many of the treaties made provisions for the education of Indigenous peoples. And so I'm going to give you some examples of those treaties when they talk about education. And so you can see that the wording is very similar to one another. So the first one is Treaty Number 4, which was signed in 1874. And it reads, open quote, Her Majesty agrees to maintain a school in the reserve allotted to each band as soon as they settle on said reserve and are prepared for a teacher, close quote. And next we have Treaty 6, which was signed in 1876, and it reads, open quote, Her Majesty agrees to maintain schools for instruction in such reserves hereby made as to her government of the Dominion of Canada may seem advisable, whenever the Indians of the reserve shall desire it, close quote. Next, we have Treaty 7, which was signed in 1877. It reads, open quote, Her Majesty agrees to pay the salary of such teachers to instruct the children and said Indians as her government of Canada may seem advisable, when said Indians are settled on their reserves and shall desire teachers, close quote. For Treaty 8, which was signed in 1899, it reads, Her Majesty agrees to pay the salaries of such teachers to instruct the children and said Indians as Her Majesty's government of Canada may seem advisable, close quote. So these are 4 of the 5 treaties that encompass the province of Alberta, as you can see on the screen. It has all of the treaties that were signed in Canada. And if you pay attention to Alberta, you can see that there is actually 5 treaties within Alberta. We have Treaty 4, Treaty 7, Treaty 6, Treaty 10, and Treaty 8. And since Blackfoot Confederacy is part of Treaty 7, I'm going to be focusing specifically on Treaty 7. So I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about my blood people. And this is a picture that comes from the courtesy of Libraries and Cultural Resources digital collections from the University of Calgary called Leading Chiefs of the Blood. It was taken in 1905. In the back row, we have Joe Healy on the left, and then on the right is Renning Crane. In the front left, we have Blackfoot Old Woman. In the middle is Jade Chief, and on the right is Cropper Wolf. So during this time period, when acts that I've mentioned throughout the presentation, from the historical records that I've read, the Blood people were amongst one of the last group of Indigenous peoples to be colonized in what is present-day Alberta, and specifically to education for Indigenous children in Canada. And so just as a side note, I did want to mention that the records would refer to the Blood people as being very large in stature, which was very intimidating for many of the colonizers who came to this area. Also, the Bloods had quite the reputation for their ability as warriors. And from my own people, I've learned that historically the Blood people were very tall people. The women were said to be around 6 feet, and the men would be taller than that. So there was a little bit of hesitancy in some ways to come into this area. And while the Blood people were amongst one of the last groups of Indigenous peoples to be colonized, the records indicate that the Blood people were actually among the first to be educated into a Euro-Western colonial school system and is what is now southern Alberta. And so what made colonial schools possible and a reality for the Blood people was the signing of Treaty 7. Another aspect of the number of treaties was constraining Indigenous peoples to live upon what is now our present-day reserves. And instead of being able to travel freely throughout our traditional territories, and in order to share this land or to coexist on this land with colonizers, we were forced to live on small tracts of land. And this would take some time, as land surveyors would come out to the traditional territories and try to map out land that they felt would be suitable for a reserve, and negotiate with government officials as well as respective Indigenous chiefs where this land should be, how large it should be, and so forth. And it would take some time to get the logistics together and then map out the official boundaries of the reserve. So after the signing of Treaty 7, it was actually a few years before the Blood Reserve was created and the Blood people moved on to the Blood Reserve. So this is a picture of Alberta that depicts all of the treaty areas as well as the different reserves that we do have in Alberta. I don't think that I can really use my pointer here to show you where Blackfoot Confederacy, where the reserves ended up being, but they're all in the southern part of Alberta. So at the very bottom southwest corner, the very largest red piece that you see is the Blood tribe. Just to the west of it is Apooyak'ii, which is by Pincher Creek. And then directly north of the Blood tribe, kind of in the middle there, would be Siksika, which is closer to Calgary. And so once the reserves were created, the government had the challenge of removing Indigenous peoples from all over their traditional territories and relocating them onto their reserves. And not only relocating them, but trying to force Indigenous peoples to permanently stay on these small tracts of land in comparison to their traditional territories. And one of the solutions that they came up with was the pass system. And while the pass system was never law, it was enforced in such a way that all Indigenous peoples were subjected to it as though it were law. And so if you don't know what the pass system is, I'll give a brief history to it. Hayter Reed, who was the Assistant Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1885, wrote the Memorandum on the Future Management of Indians and what would eventually become the pass system. And so the pass system was a process which Indigenous peoples needed to seek permission from their respective Indian agents, and the Indian agents were hired for each of the reserves to enforce Indian policy and the rules and regulations that were set out in the Indian Act. If an Indigenous person wanted to leave the reserve, and some of the examples might be if they wanted to go hunting off reserve, or if they wanted to visit family members that might live on another reserve, or even sell some of their crops or animals from their farms and ranches, they would need to get permission. So if an Indigenous person, for whatever reason, wanted to leave the reserve, they would have to go through a process of getting permission from the Indian agent. They would get a paper pass that had their name, what tribe they were from, how many days they were allowed to leave for, and the reason for leaving the reserve. And so there were a number of reasons why the Canadian government decided to implement the pass system, such as deterring large gatherings, as the government felt that large gatherings might lead to an uprising against the Canadian government, or that it may lead to practicing Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, which they wished to deter as much as possible. But largely, the pass system was for the benefit of colonizers to have Indigenous peoples remaining on their respective reserves. So this is an example of a paper pass that comes from the Canadian Encyclopedia Online. And you can see that it gives his name as John Constant, and who it looks like was from the Cumberland Band. It says that he has permission to be gone for 22 days, and he had permission to carry 1 gun. And the business that was taking him off reserve was to visit his children who were attending industrial school. He was leaving from the Duck Lake Agency, which I believe is found in central Alberta, and the pass was signed on May 25th, 1899. And so if an Indigenous person was ever caught off reserve without a pass, it was considered a crime. And although it was not a formal law, it would be punished by being arrested and escorted back to their respective reserves. I've heard other people say that the piece of paper would be pinned to the chest of the Indigenous individual, making it very easy and identifiable as the person would be off reserve, and making it easy for non-Indigenous peoples to see that they did have permission to be off reserve. And pinning a piece of paper to your chest was also seen as being very degrading to the individual. Passes were very hard to get as well. The Indian agents were not known for giving them out very often, and the pass system began to be phased out in the 1930s and 1940s, depending on where you were located in Canada. And so if you would like to learn more about the pass system, I would highly recommend watching Alex Williams' documentary called The Pass System. And it's something that you can Google online. And so why is the pass system important to our conversation? The pass system, as we've learned, was not a law, but it was used to further the assimilation agenda of the government by enforcing the rules and regulations that were outlined in the Indian Act. And unfortunately, under our time constraints, we don't have enough time to talk about the Indian Act and the role that it played in the Stolen Children Era, as well as the different school models. So if you do want to learn about that, please do join me in January. But for today, I'm going to briefly speak about the Indian Act in this context to the pass system. And one aspect of the Indian Act is that it set out all of the rules and regulations that in many areas of Indigenous people's lives, including education. This is a picture of the original Indian Act that came out in 1876. And so the Indian Act outlined the policies around education for Indigenous children, and the pass system was used to reinforce the Indian Act and make it possible that Indigenous children would be educated in colonial schools. And so children would no longer be able to be off reserve, and they would have to stay on reserve in order to attend these schools, which would eventually become mandatory. And so this was the exact goal of the government, so that children would have to be on reserve so that they could learn what we talked about in the beginning from the Gradual Civilization Act, able to speak, read, and write either the English or the French language readily and well, and is sufficiently advanced in the elementary branches of education, and is of good moral character and free from debt. And these attributes outline the type of education that Indigenous children were expected to obtain, and the obligation that the Canadian government felt that they were willing to give to Indigenous children. And so what I'm trying to get at is the government wasn't interested in allowing Indigenous children to become highly educated. The goal was not only to assimilate Indigenous children into a Euro-Western lifestyle, which I'll talk about more in my upcoming talk. It was also to give just enough education to be able to read, write, and speak in English or French. The government was only interested in providing Indigenous children with the elementary branches of education. which is very evident as you move through the different school models and the curriculum that each school model followed, which again, I will be talking about in my upcoming talk. The government's goals for Indigenous education was never meant to provide the type of education where Indigenous children could pursue higher education or to even compete with their non-Indigenous counterparts. In the historical documents that I read, the Indian superintendent would receive letters from concerned Canadians about the type of education that Indigenous children were receiving. So not only did Euro-Western Canadians not want to live with Indigenous peoples, who wanted them to stay on their respective reserves, but they also didn't want themselves or their children to have to compete with Indigenous peoples for jobs. And the Indian superintendent would reassure them that the type of education that Indigenous children were receiving would never allow them to be competitive. And so I want to read a salient quote from John A. Macdonald, who we all know was the first Prime Minister of Canada. And it reads, open quote, "When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write," close quote. Instead, the type of education that the Canadian government provided for Indigenous peoples was meant to assimilate Indigenous children into a Euro-Western lifestyle. And within Euro-Western standards, it led to the reinforcement of the arbitrary racial hierarchy, where Indigenous peoples would be on the bottom. It also reinforced classism, where Indigenous peoples were being relegated to a particular lower social class that their education would ensure. And this also left no room for social mobility within Euro-Western standards. So if you don't have access to what would be considered a good education, even for during the Stolen Children Era, it would have the effect of creating generations of Indigenous peoples who received a subpar education, which would disadvantage us when it comes to employment opportunities, and would entrench for many of us, according to Western standards, to be part of the lower working class, which again left only opportunities for farming or ranching on one's respective reserve, which was actually another goal of the Indian Act. And so these educational policies also set a precedent in the way that colonizers think about, treat, and value Indigenous peoples in all facets of society. In terms of Southern Alberta history, the Blood people were amongst the first to have schools built and to receive a colonial education with the limitations of the elementary branches of education that we discussed earlier. And it was so important to the Canadian government to first establish schools for the Blood children that many of the surrounding non-Indigenous communities around the Blood Reserve did not have a school in operation. And this speaks to the relentless efforts that the Canadian government exerted to try and assimilate Indigenous peoples, from this country. And so if you join me in my next talk, when I speak about the different school models that the Canadian government used, it's evident that the Canadian government was not easily discouraged. If one school model did not work out, they would just create a new school model in hopes that it would be more effective at assimilating Indigenous children. And we can see from the quote from John A. Macdonald, the type of education that Indigenous children received was never meant to make us highly educated or to even welcome us into a Euro-Western society. The education provided for Indigenous children was what was thought of as being good enough for Indigenous children, who ultimately would be working as farmers and ranchers or wives of farmers and ranchers on their respective reserves, and to never be above working class according to Euro-Western standards. So I would like to read another quote for you, and this quote comes from Duncan Campbell Scott, and he was the Deputy Superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs. And it reads, open quote, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not an Indian that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department," close quote. And so I have a diagram on the screen. This is using Blackfoot pictograms. The pictograms in generations 1, 2, and 3 is the pictogram that represents the blood tribe or Ghana. And the Canadian government truly believed that after a few generations of educating Indigenous children under the colonial school system, that it would produce children who had been assimilated into a Euro-Western life. The pictograms in generations 4 and 5 represent Napiguans, which means white Euro-Western people. And the symbol of the cross on top of the triangle represents the Christian missionaries who settled in the area. And so the Canadian government believed that Indigenous children, after attending these school models, that they would no longer want to be Indigenous or even claim their indigeneity, that we would all become Euro-Western citizens of Canada. And it was clear from the records that the Canadian government, their officials, and the religions who ran the government-sanctioned schools, that they never believed that Indigenous peoples would exist today. They never expected somebody like myself, who is Indigenous, to be educated and to have a doctorate degree, like many of my other tribal members do today, to ever be reading and studying these records that I'm sharing with you today. How wrong these individuals were. We are still here, and we are still Indigenous. Despite the government's best efforts to change us and to assimilate us into a Eurocentric way of life, we have resisted. We have resisted the calls to rid the Canadian population of the Indian problem. We have resisted the mission of the residential schools, which Henry Richard Pratt referred to as to kill the Indian in him and save the man. We have fought and are still fighting to retain and maintain our Indigenous ways of life so that we can continue to practice and live our own ways of knowing, being, and doing. We are still here. We are resilient. We are Indigenous. So why should everyone care about this history that I shared with you today? Why should you care about what has happened in the past to Indigenous peoples and our home traditional lands? And I think that you do care because you are here today, and I thank you for coming. And as I've been conducting research in this area, I've come to realize that many Canadians have a few misconceptions surrounding colonization. And tonight, I would like to be able to address 2 of those misconceptions with you. So the first misconception is there is a belief that colonization has benefited everyone. And second, there is also a belief that colonization happened a long time ago and that Indigenous people should be over this by now. And I want you to know that these beliefs are not true. And I would like to share some statistics with you that come from the latest statistics from Statistics Canada, as well as from the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women's and Girls Final Report. So according to these statistics, Indigenous peoples have the highest rates of socioeconomic distress, are least likely to be employed, have a lower total income, have a lower life expectancy, have the lowest high school graduation rates, are overrepresented in custody and community programs, and are more likely to be the victims of violent crimes than any other ethnic or racial group in Canada. Indigenous women only represent 2.4% of the total Canadian population, but are 16 times more likely to be sexually assaulted, including raped, and are more likely to be beaten, battered, and or murdered than any other ethnic or racial group in Canada. So these statistics illustrate the long-lasting and damaging effects that colonization has had and continues to have on Indigenous peoples in Canada. Colonization has not benefited Indigenous peoples the same way that colonization has benefited those who have settled upon these lands and who have benefited from the oppression of Indigenous peoples through the Indian policy that Duncan Campbell Scott so famously said was to get rid of the Indian problem by trying to ensure that we did not exist. And these statistics that I shared with you illustrates what happens when a country tries to destroy a people's language, their ways of knowing, being, and doing through laws, legislation, and policy. And the reason that we as Indigenous peoples can't get over it is that we are still living with being colonized and trying to survive colonization. I actually called my research study, We Are Needs to Be, Surviving Colonization. And I named it that specifically because we are still trying to survive colonization. And for these reasons, this is why the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action are so important. They're not just good practices. They are actions that allow Indigenous peoples to move beyond merely surviving, but instead enter into a place in our lives where we can finally thrive. And we have to do this as a nation. As a nation in Canada, we need to heal together. Within the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, there is a call upon all facets of Canadian society to correct what has been wrong and to further their education and knowledge in regards to the Stolen Children Era, which includes the residential schools. And it's important for all Canadians, regardless of your race or your ethnicity, to hear these stories and to learn the truth about Canada's dealings with the original peoples of these lands, the Indigenous peoples. Hearing truth-telling that comes from listening to the stories of our past can make a difference for our future as a nation. In a previous research study that I conducted, I examined different approaches that Alberta Education uses to teach secondary students about the Indigenous peoples in Canada, to determine which approach was the most effective at creating positive perceptions of Indigenous peoples. And I learned that those students who took a course dedicated solely to learning about Indigenous peoples had a more positive perception of Indigenous peoples. Research shows that students who enter high school with negative perceptions of Indigenous peoples are more likely to graduate high school still holding on to those negative perceptions. Education is one of the key recommendations that comes out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action. Education from kindergarten to grade 12, as well as post-secondary institutions, plays a pivotal role in truth-telling. Senator Murray Sinclair, who is the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, also shares these sentiments. He said, open quote, "It was the educational system that has contributed to this problem in this country, and it is the educational system, we believe, that is going to help us get away from this," close quote. And this is one reason why it is so important that we use education to right these wrongs, where we potentially can catch students who eventually grow up to be adults and enter the Canadian workforce and will work with Indigenous peoples in sectors like health and education. It's important that we catch them before they leave high school and before they enter the workforce and help dissuade them of any negative perceptions that they might hold in regards to Indigenous peoples, which can potentially reverse the statistics that I shared with you earlier. And as I've taught at the post-secondary level, many of the concepts that we've talked about tonight, I have taught to my students. And for many of them, they shared with me how this was the first time in their lives that they were learning about these topics and how shocking it was for them to be learning about this for the first time as adults in university. They were so disappointed that this was not part of the kindergarten to grade 12 curriculum. And this speaks to the important role that education plays in truth-telling. Education has the power to reverse the statistics that I've shared with you. Education has the power to no longer have these statistics be a reality, but instead become a part of our past, and to move into a place where Indigenous peoples can heal from colonization and finally begin to thrive. To end, I would like to read to you another quote from Senator Murray Sinclair, who has spoke on numerous occasions on why education and truth-telling is so important to us as a Canadian nation. Open quote, "We should never forget, even once they have learned from it, because it's a part of who we are. It's not just a part of who we are as survivors and children of survivors and relatives of survivors. It is a part of who we are as a nation. And this nation must never forget what it once did to its most vulnerable population," close quote. The most vulnerable population being the Indigenous children who the Canadian government and religions targeted generation after generation after generation for over a century and a half. and many of these children never made it home again. We see many different Indigenous peoples across Canada unearthing hidden graves around the colonial schools that were built on their reserves. As a nation, we must never forget what has happened. Again, thank you for coming to my talk today, and I hope that you learned something. I hope that you'll consider coming to my future lectures and presentations to further your learning around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action, as well as the Stolen Children Era. As mentioned at the beginning of the talk, I will be giving another talk in January where I will be going over the different school models that the Canadian government used to try and assimilate Indigenous children. And I will be talking about what is the difference between each of those school models, what were the policies put in place so that those school models came to be, and some stories that go along with the school models from people who attended the different school models. So this is the invitation. There is a QR code on it that you can use to register for the event. I've also put my contact information up there if you would like to contact me and get a emailed invitation of the upcoming talk. And also, I published a short video where I summarize the first year of this research project, and I talk about the processes that I undertook during the study, and I speak to my perspective as an intergenerational survivor of the Indian residential school system. I also talk about what it was like to work on this project with my mother, who is a survivor of the residential school system. And so I would highly encourage you to watch the video if you are eager to learn more about this topic, and I hope that you are. You can find the research video on my YouTube channel. You can also email me as well if you would like a link to it. So I'm just going to go back to my contact information, and I'm going to turn the time over to the Q&A. Thank you again for coming.
That was absolutely fantastic. It was thought-provoking, it was informative, it was poignant, it was compelling, and I really appreciated it. In fact, everyone was so enthralled with the talk that no one even gave me the mic I need to run around asking questions. So once I have that, what I would like to do is call upon our audience in person here to ask any questions they have of Dr. Tiffany Prete. Apooyak'ii, and we also have an online community here today, and so there may be some questions coming to us from our virtual community as well. So with that, before we begin though, I think we should have a round of applause again for Dr. Prete for a fantastic presentation. So there must be lots of questions.
Hi, is this on? Hi there, Tiffany. I just want to say great job, and sorry. I really identify with you when you say we are still here. And we are individuals with our education as doctors, and I'm on a path to be a social worker at this point, and so I'm glad that you emphasize that that education is available to us to this day. I was curious if you have any research done on the Indian placement program within the LDS religion, and as far as what's that done, and as far as like where I just find that throughout a lot of the research there that hasn't been mentioned, and if you've had any research regarding that.
Great. Thank you very much for your question. I actually haven't researched that area. I've specifically just focused on the Canadian government's assimilation policies, so taking a look at the different school models that they have implemented. So that would be an area that I don't think has been researched very much, and so maybe something that you would like to do in the research that you're going to do as you complete your degree. But thank you for your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm relatively new to this part of Alberta, this part of the country, actually. So,
Is this one working? Try this one.
okay, try again. Yeah, it sounds like it's working. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm relatively new to.
Well,
You know what? My voice is probably big enough to not use the mic. Okay. Third try. Thank you very much. I'm relatively new to Southern Alberta, having moved here in 2019, and then we know what happened in the next 2.5 years. So I feel like I'm still a newcomer. Everything you said is very informative to me. In the months before we had the lockdown, I was able to begin learning a lot. And I did, and this could be misinformation, but I did understand that the past system with respect to Lethbridge continued a very long time past 1940. In fact, I've heard as late as 1972 before it was finally dispensed with. Is that misinformation, or is there some validity to that?
that's a good question, and thank you for coming and for asking that question. So as I was going through the historical documents, there's so much information in it that I really had to narrow what my focus was going to be on as I traveled to the different museums and archives. And so I specifically focused on education. So there were a lot of other things that I would have liked to have been able to read about. And so the past system, I didn't research any further into it, just as it pertains to the education system. So I don't know what the answer would be to your question, unfortunately. So I'm sorry.
Well, perhaps sometime in the future. But I heard of it in relation to children who were coming into the city to go to high school. And if they did not happen to have their pass card with them, they experienced a lot of grief. And often that resulted in eventually they just give up. They got fed up with it. So it is perhaps an important aspect of relationships within this area.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you. Something definitely that I will be keeping my eye out for as I continue looking at the records. Thank you.
Next question.
Okay. Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you very much for the presentation, and thank you very much for the hard work of giving a talk like this and educating us. I really agree with your students in that I'm always continually amazed at how little I actually know about this topic, so I really appreciate your work here. So I have a lot of questions about the different school systems, but I think I will wait and go to your talk in January to learn about that. But I'm curious about the history in terms of the age range. And so if in your work, what was the government's plan for the adults? And at what point, I'm assuming the plan was to try to assimilate all groups, or perhaps just contain the adults and assimilate the children. I'm not really sure, but I'm curious at sort of what threshold a youth was no longer, considered eligible for their programs.
Oh, those are really great questions, and you might have to remind me of some of them while I answer it. Under the Indian Act, and when I talk in January, it'll probably make more sense because I have some slides to show with you that go along with that. But The Indian Act was originally came out in 1876, but we actually have many amendments to the Indian Act that have come out since then. There's been over 100 amendments to the Indian Act, actually. And so not every amendment had to do with education, but a lot of them did have to do with education. And so sometimes the age range would change. And so it just kind of depended on what the school model was, what the era was, who the prime minister was, who was the superintendent, and what it was that they felt was going to be the best at trying to assimilate Indigenous children. And so, usually it was between the ages of 7 and 15 that it was supposed to be mandatory. But again, that number would change depending on what the year was. And for myself, as I was looking through the records for the blood people, I actually found records where they took children as young as age 0 and were putting them into these school models. And so when a child came of age, which would be 15, technically they could leave these schools. But if the principal decided that they wanted to keep them, they would just write the Indian commissioner and ask if they could keep them until they were 18. And then legally, the child would have to stay until they were 18 years of age. Of course, the Indian commissioners were going to turn that down. I have seen in some of the records as well in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that they were keeping the children even into adulthood. So some of them were 20, 21. So I think it really does depend on who the principal was of the school and what they thought was important. So there's a huge range of students who had to attend the school. And so the second part of your question about assimilating adults. So the Indian Act itself was an assimilation policy. So it was meant for everyone. It was meant to apply to adults. But the Canadian government realized that it was not going to be very effective if they just went and tried to assimilate the adults, and that's why they went after the children. So if they could make policy around education and separate the Indigenous child from their families, which will make more sense if you do come to my talk in January, if they could separate the child from their family, they felt that it would be easier to assimilate them. And so they spent most of their efforts trying to assimilate the children so that in a couple of generations, the adults, the elders of that community would die off. And then they were creating generations of children who had been what they hoped would be to be assimilated into Euro-Western society and culture. And that is one of the reasons why there's so many different school models, because they just couldn't figure out a model that actually worked the way that they wanted them to. And now we have to live with the negative consequences of what the government did for over a century and a half. And fortunately live with those consequences. Thank you.
For our next question, we're going to test our technology and have it asked virtually. I'll turn it over to Catherine.
Hi, Tiffany. I have a comment for you first from the Anderson family, who says, "Excellent work, Dr. Prete. Thanks for sharing your research." And then we have a question from Tatiana, who she would like to know, do you have any examples of the old colonial educational policies in the modern school system?
Ooh, in the school system today?
Yes, a modern day school system.
Well, the modern day school system, it's still in place. So we have public schools. We also have federal schools that run on the reserve. And while some people might say that we are not living in an age of colonization, we are still living in an age of colonization. So if we have moved beyond colonization, that would mean that today we would be having this conversation in Blackfoot as we live on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot people. All of you here would have to have learned Blackfoot for your jobs. And so my children go to a school where they're taught to speak, read, and write in English instead of in their Blackfoot language. And so that is still part of the Canadian government's way of trying to continue assimilation, unfortunately. So we are still in a state of colonization, and we still do have these assimilation policies that are in place. There's just this belief that colonization no longer exists, but it still does. We see it in the public school system, also in our federal school systems as well. Thank you for your question.
We have one more question that's come in online from Dan. He says, thank Dr. Prete for your work and informative talk. I understand Indigenous education has been a federal responsibility. Do you believe in having provincially administered programs?
Could you read that to me one more time? I'm sorry.
So the question is, I understand Indigenous education has been a federal responsibility. Do you believe in having a provincially administered program? There's a missing word, so I'm thinking it's program. I'm not sure. So.
Right. It's an interesting question because, yes, under the Indian Act, Indigenous education is supposed to be federally. But in an amendment to the Indian Act in 1985, the Canadian government made it a provincial or territorial, it's kind of like a reassignment from federal to provincial and territorial. And so the provinces and territories now have the responsibility of taking up Indigenous education. But federally, there is still the federal fiduciary responsibility of the Canadian government to provide education for Indigenous children because of what is written in the Indian Act, was that they were to provide education for Indigenous children. So we do see provinces and territories as well as federally having some kind of responsibility for Indigenous education. Thank you.
Hi, Tiffany. Over here. Hi, thanks for your presentation. I just wanted to know something that kind of lingered in my head while attending university and college was how far behind were our Indigenous children compared to non-Indigenous children in education and in their learning development due to intergenerational trauma. I was talking with one of my relatives, and she was saying, she took her master's in Native American Studies, and she was saying it could be about 7 generations until Indigenous people are on the same learning level as non-Indigenous people. So I'm a first-generation survivor. My dad was a residential school survivor. And so I was doing the math, and I was like, oh, wow, that's going to be like my kids, and then my grandkids, and then 5 great-great-great, till we're on the same level as non-Indigenous children. Have you come across any of that kind of research, or has it kind of come across your mind, maybe?
It has, and I'm actually hoping to be able to address something like that in my program of work as it continues. So I think it's really important that we take a look at our past so that we can learn what has happened, so that we know how to move forward. And so as part of my first steps, I'm taking a look at the colonial history so that we know what has happened, so that we can create models where we can heal from the intergenerational trauma. And I really like a quote from Senator Murray Sinclair when he talks about this, and he says that it took us several generations to get to the point where we are today, and it's going to take another several generations to get out of the place that we are right now. And so we do see school systems like different provinces who decide to try and do something, and they might try something for a couple of years and think that it's not working and try something different or just give up, which is unfortunate because of just how many generations that it took to get here. It's not going to be anything easy. It's going to take time, and we need to be able to see those initiatives fully play out to see if they're beneficial or not. And so there's a lot of work to be done in that area, and something that I am hoping to be able to do with my program of work as it does move forward. And unfortunately, at this time, there really isn't anything that is in place. So, but thank you very much for your question.
Hello? Oh, sorry, over here. Thanks, Dr. Prete, and like others, I just want to thank you for your work, and like many others in the room, I have a lot to learn, and so maybe this, and I think this question might be on the periphery of your research, so maybe you're not going to be able to answer it, but I'm curious, in terms of, one of the things that, as you've pointed out, comes from not having knowledge is not having truth, and the kind of myths that then circulate. And so one of those myths is around this, idea of free education. And so I'm curious whether that myth comes from those particular parts of the treaty, or whether there's other parts of the treaty language beyond what you shared there that are about that kind of, like I'm thinking about post-secondary education and this idea that this provision of education, and thank you for helping us to understand that exactly that provision wasn't really meant to be educational. But so what about at that post-secondary level, where we know that funding is not actually available in the way that much of the Canadian public thinks that it is for the broad majority of Indigenous peoples who want to access education?
Okay. You said a lot there, thank you. And I had to think about what you meant by free education. But I think I know what you're saying by free education. Could you just tell me again what the question is around free education?
Sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, I think just that there is this myth that circulates, right? That Indigenous peoples can attend post-secondary institutions free of charge. And so I'm curious whether the origin of that is coming from this kind of provision of education from the treaties, or whether there's something else at play there.
Okay. Thank you, and I do think that is a common misconception that many people have about Indigenous peoples, especially when it comes to this idea of free. So if you do study all of the treaties and the different laws and legislations that there are in Canada, it didn't come for free. So in order for people who are not Indigenous, so let's just say specifically to Blackfoot Traditional Territory, for anybody to be able to settle on Blackfoot Traditional Territory, the government made certain promises to give to the Blackfoot people so that people could settle on these lands, and one of them is education. And so when I'm focusing more, I guess, on the kindergarten to grade 12, because that was what the government tried so hard to assimilate through. But at the time that the treaties were made in the Indian Act, there was absolutely no desire for the Canadian government to ever have highly educated Indigenous peoples. And so the education that they're referring to is more elementary. They didn't even offer high school for Indigenous peoples for many, many years. And I believe on my reserve, it wasn't until 1960 that they actually had high school graduates, because it was the first time that it was being offered on the Blood Reserve. And so we see a lot of policy starting to change. I could be here forever talking to you about the policy, but in the Indian Act and the treaties, it was mostly referring to what we would say today, kindergarten to grade 12, and so post-secondary education actually wasn't included in that. And so those of us who are Indigenous who do attend post-secondary institutions, we don't get a free education. We have to find ways of being able to support ourselves as we do take on post-secondary education. Myself, I worked 2 jobs while I did my doctorate degree so that I could afford to go to graduate studies and get my PhD. So there is this misconception that I think does come from not understanding the treaties and the Indian Act. Indigenous people do not get post-secondary education for free, and it is a barrier, unfortunately, for many Indigenous students who would like to go to post-secondary and be able to be educated. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Tiffany, for coming to educate us. My question is, would it be beneficial for Indigenous people to revoke the Indian Act?
Thank you for your question, and that is a debate that is going on if the Indian Act should be revoked, if it should be amended. There are some who would like to have the Indian Act revoked, and some only amended, and so it's an ongoing conversation. There are certain, obligations that have come out of the treaty or through the Indian Act that some people would like to be able to see in place, but there hasn't really been a consensus on that, so it is still an ongoing conversation that is happening today. So I don't really have any more to comment on that, but thank you for your question.
Thanks. We have another. Oh, we've got an online question, and we might be able to squeeze in two more after that. So just before we go to the online question, I mean, there was this point made about the unavailability of funding, sometimes for higher education. There's a lot of people in the room today. There's a special program on at the U of L for scholarships with the potential of matching, so get your idea juices flowing. I'll turn it over to Catherine, who's going to read one of the online questions.
Hi, Tiffany. Thank you, Dr. Prete. Do you believe there are enough resources that help Indigenous children now to relearn their roots and combat the effects of the colonial school system?
It's a good question, and it's really hard to say because we're talking about not just a group of Indigenous peoples. That's kind of more of a question for Indigenous peoples across Canada. So I couldn't really answer that because I can't speak for every Indigenous groups in Canada. But I would say that there's probably some Indigenous groups who may have had the ability to get funding to do programs like that and are working on it, whereas there are probably some Indigenous groups who may not have been able to get funding in order to do programs like that, unfortunately. So I'd say some Indigenous groups are able to do that, but not everybody. So it is something that we definitely could do better at as a nation, being able to provide that kind of resources for Indigenous peoples to heal from the trauma of being colonized and being able to return to our traditional ways of life. Thank you for the question.
Hello, Dr. Prete. Thank you very much for your very informative, inspiring talk. I want to ask, I believe you said in the midst of, earlier on in your talk, that you came across examples of non-Indigenous children, K-12 system, taking courses about Indigenous people and history, and that they graduated with a better understanding. Did you come across any exemplars within the education system that you would point to as and hold up that various boards of education or schools should look to as they're thinking about educating everyone, all K-12 children?
Great question, and I could also spend an entire lecture just sharing with you what I know about that in my own research. So I did talk earlier about an amendment to the Indian Act in 1985 when the federal government made it a provincial and territorial responsibility for Indigenous education. And so after 1985, all the provinces and territories in Canada had a responsibility to Indigenous education. And if you look at the different provinces and territories, they would start to come out with policies around Indigenous education. And many of the policies or frameworks that they created are very similar to one another. And usually it was two approaches, which was either taking a mandatory course at some point in kindergarten to grade 12 for students to learn, or it was trying to integrate Indigenous content into the kindergarten to grade 12 curriculum. And most of the provinces and territories decided to try and integrate Indigenous content into the curriculum. And what the research has found, including my own research, is that many of these policy frameworks were put in place, but there was not any kind of support for teachers to learn how to actually integrate Indigenous content into their classrooms. They went from one day not having to do it to the next day it suddenly being mandated and not needing to go to post-secondary education to earn additional credentials or areas specific to that, or professional development. And so what many researchers, including myself, have found is that integrating Indigenous content has not been effective. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't work, it's just that we don't have teachers who know actually how to do it. And so it hasn't been effective because no one's actually using the framework properly. And so my research has specifically focused on Alberta because my tribe is here in Alberta. But the research is very similar for other provinces as well. They're finding that teachers are just not able to integrate it because they don't have the support. We do see now, and particularly in Alberta, that teacher education programs are now making it mandatory for at least one course to be on in Indigenous peoples in some sort, so that pre-service teachers going into service, that they have some kind of background. Alberta Education has made an effort and has changed the teaching quality standards where teachers are expected to know about Indigenous content. And so in my research that I conducted, what I found was that actually taking a mandatory course was more beneficial than integrating, but again, only because teachers didn't know how to integrate. So being able to take a mandatory course or taking a course was the most beneficial way of actually getting Indigenous content into the curriculum. But my recommendation was not actually to make it mandatory, and only for the reason that to get into post-secondary institutions, and not all post-secondary institutions, but there are some post-secondary institutions where you actually don't need a high school diploma in order to make it into university. And so some students, if they didn't want to take the course on Indigenous peoples, wouldn't have to take it, could still move on with their lives. And so my recommendation is actually to take Aboriginal Studies, which is a course that Alberta Education created as part of its mandate around Indigenous education. I recommended that they take Aboriginal Studies 10 and integrate it into the social studies curriculum, because they already have a budget around social studies. They can do professional development for their teachers. And so it's a big undertaking, but we do need to have the curriculum restructured in order to actually take on what Indigenous education needs to be successful. So thank you for your question.
Yes, I will. Oh, go loud. Okay, there. Ooh, there we go. I wanted to congratulate you because you are a woman who is thriving in the world, and it's so encouraging to see somebody like you be as successful as you are. And I'm going to ask you a very difficult question right now. I'm just going to imagine that empty table right here is filled with people who are homeless, who are part of the Tent City family, and I'm just wondering if you could say anything to them that could provide them hope for the future and allow them to have the success that you have had in your life.
Thank you for your question. As Dr. Prete, one of the #1 questions that I do get asked beyond why can't I just get over it is what am I going to do about the Indian problem? And I don't think that there's anything wrong with us. If there's anything that I can do with my education, it is to help educate the rest of Canada about what has happened to Indigenous peoples, because we need to make changes. Thank you. We need to make changes in the way that society thinks about and treats Indigenous peoples so that we don't have homeless Indigenous peoples. And once we're able to do that as a nation, we will see Indigenous peoples start to flourish. But thank you for your question.
Well, that was absolutely fabulous. Thank you very much.